Hi, welcome to this webinar outlining how we think developer experience is going to impact your organization and the scope of developer experience. So what it is, why it's important, and what we think we can do to help. My name's Phil. I'm the global practice lead here at Valiantys for DevEx and SDLC, and let's dive right in. So I'm a big believer in telling you the takeaway up front. In this case, we believe developer experience is the sum of all the elements that go into how your organization translates developer time into organizational value. That means it covers everything from your software product development lifecycle and all the adjacent pieces to it as well. Um, while there's no individual score for developer experience, I think a lot of people are looking to improve it. And one of the best ways I think you can get a feel for the developer experience within your organization is through a number of ways that you see um, your ability to translate the limited amount of developer time that you have into the organizational value that they're looking to create. To do this, let's break this down, and we'll talk about all of these today in isolation, but a lot of these obviously have interconnected effects and are leverage points that you could potentially look at as an integration. So I think of this as a tapestry. The reason is because all these things interweave. Developers touch all these components, and this is by no means a complete view of developer experience within an organization, but it's a starting point to have a conversation around starting to measure, starting to track, starting to understand, and how the impacts all lead to that takeaway that I mentioned up front, which is how you translate time, the investment within your people, um, and that just not just the time, but also obviously the tools as an adjacent piece to that, into value, which comes out the other end of your developer development lifecycle. So you have the track here going left to right in light blue, which is kind of a simplified version of your SDLC. This is the flow of work, right? I think I want to be really explicit here, and I want to talk about the flow of work from conception all the way through operation and potentially even kind of retirement. But there's that particular angle, and then basically each of these pieces touch each of those, right? So um, tooling and process, collaboration and culture, software quality, hiring and onboarding, clarity and purpose are just a couple of the items, and they permeate through each step of the life cycle, right? These are the things that the developers then interact with. So really, you shouldn't be looking at each of these dark blue chevrons aligned to where they are along the SDLC, but you should assume all of them apply at all times because it's along that dimension. As I hinted at, we'll talk about all of these in isolation, explaining how they impact the developer experience within your organization, why it's worth investing in, what are some common patterns that we see. But really, real life is obviously a little messier. You'll probably be a little bit across the board in terms of where you guys are doing really well, where people are struggling. And as such, I think it's worth making sure that when you have this conversation in terms of like truly diagnosing what's going on and how you can improve things, you don't look at each thing in isolation as if they are just Lego blocks, but you also have to look at it from a systems perspective. So how they interact, how they potentially force you to make trade-offs, because that is really the name of the game. You're going to be looking to make trade-offs between where you're going to get benefits and where you're going to have to give a little from an operational efficiency perspective because you have other constraints within your organization. Collaboration and culture is probably the easiest where you can highlight some of that. Um, the other thing I wanted to point out is that DevEx really extends not just to the developer as an individual or as a team, but also their interactions with everybody else within your organization. So a good example would be how developers work with the customer support function or customer success function within your organization. Anytime they work on tickets, bugs, and things like that, nominally, on the face of it, it's a distraction from them being able to do feature work. But practically, it's a lot more complicated than that. Obviously, they have to understand the customer's context, make sure that the support team is fully enabled, capable of handling all that stuff. that the tooling interfaces well, right? They don't want to fight and have to go wrangle and look for information across different systems and things like that. All these things are complex, but they're just an indication like this is a place where they can learn, they can have an impact, they can provide value, but you want to do so deliberately and efficiently. And this extends not just to these five, but any organization um, within your company interacting with your development org is going to have these kind of questions. They're going to be trade-offs. How do they interact? How do they collaborate? And so oftentimes you'll have a developer experience type of conversation. How can we optimize for the developers? And that's purely because that's the nature of this particular conversation right now. But what you're really looking to do is optimize operational efficiency across the organization. And sometimes it's okay for the developer efficiency in and of itself to be, I don't want to say hampered, but you give a little to make marketing and IT and sales, for example, operate more smoothly, because that's where you're going for that global optimum as opposed to some sort of local one. And that conception or that concept, sorry, applies across the board because I think really good DevEx in most cases is a rising tide that lifts all boats. Absolutely smoother access to systems, um, fewer context switching situations, things like that benefit everybody. But at the same time, there are going to be situations where you have trade-offs, and I want to make sure that we call out both of them because you need to be aware when you are investing and it's going to benefit everybody, and where you want to go in explicitly understanding this is a trade-off, and within your organizational context the trade-off might look one way, within another organization the trade-off looks a different way, and it's just good to be aware of these things. So let's dive into one example of developer experience, and this is where a lot of the organizational, or sorry, a lot of the conversation ends up being focused. So, and rightly so, mind you. Tooling and process is an area where we as Valiantys obviously have a lot of history. We've worked with Atlassian for a long, long time. Um, and in this is a space that's moving very, very quickly, right? Generative AI tools obviously have become effectively mainstream faster than any other tooling I've ever seen. And there's a perception that that means that building software is now fast, it's easy, which I would actually go back and push back because creating production grade enterprise software is complex. It requires many tools to do correctly because you have to balance a bunch of constraints, especially if you're working, which most organizations are, on an existing code base. Any new addition adds areas that need to be maintained, constraints, again, trade-offs within your product. And so all this is complexity that needs to be managed. And tooling in and of itself is also an expense, right? It costs time and it costs money to implement, to train, to maintain. And firms often have to focus on making sure they have enough tooling, but also just enough tooling. There's a bit of a Goldilocks element here. You want to make sure you have enough tooling that covers every use case that you need, right? From security to quality to understanding how your customers are using it, all the way along various spectra, infrastructure, application architecture, etc. And you don't want too much because then you have overlapping tools and potential areas where one tool is saying one thing and one is the other. So you're looking for deduplication to minimize time and money overlap and waste. Um, so you're looking for that, like I said, Goldilocks zone in a lot of this. And this applies to process as well. You're looking for a structure within your organization that allows for everybody to do what they need to do, that they know how to operate in a given scenario. So whether you hand a certain ticket to one developer or another, the way they go about it, the steps that they will do to deliver against it will be the same. A good example would be what is your standard operating procedure when a critical vulnerability is identified within your software stack? Regardless of who's on call, they have to go through a standard operating procedure to identify, put a mitigation plan in place, communicate this out, et cetera, et cetera. We can talk about incident management. It's an area we also have a lot of experience with at a different time. But as a for instance, it doesn't matter who's on call. They should know what to do, know what the steps are, and be able to deliver against it. And you as an organization want to make sure that you know that that's in place. And so process exists the same way, whether it's the interaction with marketing, handling security incidents, how you plan and prioritize. A process allows you to handle everything that could come up. Um, I would add one thing, and that is that you need to have always an escape valve. There is always needs to be some form of, in case of emergency, break glass, do this, and skip everything. Um, One of the things that I think is really important to understand, I'll give you an anecdote real quick, is when you push to production or when you create a pull request that needs to be merged, you kick off a whole bunch of stuff within your CI/CD pipelines. You've got security processes, you've got a whole bunch of tests, and this multi-stage builds, this can take a while. And when I was a developer, this took, I think, 35 minutes to kick off and deploy to production if we did everything right. And we had an incident once for a Sev1 P1, and we needed to skip all the tests. We didn't need to run end-to-end unit tests because we had already agreed this is the push, this is basically the fix. We need to push it out to production because there was a massive security risk. And there was a button, not a real button, but there was a way we could do that. We could skip the tests. And it was relatively easy to do, and we did. The side effect of this particular tool is that it sent an email to our founder or partners, we are skipping the tests. And so in that situation, you can easily justify this because you're probably going to get an email back saying like, hey, Phil, what's going on? Why did you press the big red button? And when you have the argument to say, we had a Sev1 P1, there was a massive problem with the version of the database we were using. We couldn't afford to go through all the testing. We needed to plug that hole first. In parallel, we obviously started to do all the tests for the hot fix, and we put a more permanent fix in place. But you can argue and probably get away with, as we did, using that particular button. However, you can't do that for everything, right? You can't do that for every situation. And so you want to make sure that you're covering with process and tools 99% of the cases that you need to deal with. And you want to make sure that that's all seamless, they work together, there's an integration, data flows, thinking flows, because every time you have to context switch and do things manually or move from a different type of interface to another tool over here, drag things over, copy paste, that is a mental tax. And that mental tax impacts your ability to manage complexity because it's adding complexity to your plate effectively. And most conversations when they talk about developers of protecting their flow and deep work time, they center around the concept of doing deep work. And on an individual level, this is super important to understand and to facilitate within an organization. I've always thought of it as juggling. That's the mental model I always had. And I will explain this. My wife understands it this way as well, because I've always explained it this way. To work on a complex task with multiple systems interacting in really complicated ways, you are effectively trying to juggle 15, 20 things in your mind at the same time. And to do this, you do this incrementally, right? You keep loading things into memory effectively. And as soon as you're distracted, everything falls on the floor and you have to start over again. This is a good comic that kind of illustrates what that looks like, which is why when we talk about interactions and collaboration, you need to find a balance between enabling deep work time for individuals to do the work, as well as making sure they have time and the circumstances to collaborate and share and help one another. But you want to make sure that that focus time is protected. It is probably the most sacred piece when it comes to developers. There's a lot of ways to look at this, but I think it's really just key to think if you look at your developer schedule, do they have meetings sporadically throughout the day, that there is no block of 4 hours that they can work, 3 hours that they can work on a large, complicated task, because that impacts the type of work they can do. If they're constantly doing really, really small things, you can't actually take on massive chunks of feature work, innovation, technical debt remediation, etc. And so it's really worth thinking that these large chunks of focus time are the way to translate that. And so a single 4 hour block obviously is worth more than 4 1 hour blocks, which is already better than 16 blocks of 15 minutes, right? Those are effectively unable to do anything meaningful. You can only do small little bits. Um, and so identifying and protecting those times is probably one of the highest ROI investments from a developer experience perspective that you can make. But it is not trivial because you need to go organizationally and make sure that it is understood. Can they do this? How do you do this without interrupting everybody else's flow? Because you can't do it in such a way that you're just negating or ignoring the rest of the world and the rest of the organization. But you do need the ability to go do this without dropping it. And this is doable, but it requires deliberate effort. So, one thing I think we need to talk about a little bit is the relationship between process and tooling. So, as I mentioned, like there are a lot of similarities between them. You want to make sure that you have just enough and the right kind. You also, the way you set up and configure your tools is a way of codifying your process. And so, whether you are fighting your tools or working with them in the way they're intended, there's a lot of potential friction or speed up that's available here. But your process, the documented way, and the way people actually do is a way that you encourage organizationally how you want your teams to work, how you want them to interact with one another, how they support one another, but also how they support the vision of the organization, right? You want to document how decisions are made, how work and value and communication flows and is codified. So this is to say, like, you have to think about it not just this process in terms of like the SDLC, but also in terms of, hey, how do you notify developers? How do you ask for help? Do you ping them in Slack? Maybe. But do you expect them to reply every 15 minutes? Probably not. Um, and on the other side, on the developer end, maybe you should encourage them to have their notifications off because they can work on things. Finding the right balance, again, all these things, that's your process. That is what that looks like. And so it's worth having a holistic view of what that looks like, document it, understand the trade-offs across the board, because in most cases, you want to be explicit about these things because otherwise they just happen in the wild and then you have no control over them and you just get what you get. Now, talking about tooling and process obviously brings itself to the conversation around collaboration and culture. Um, I'm not going to talk about all the different ways that you can instill agility and an agile mindset in your developer teams and your organization. I'm not going to talk about how you can correctly prioritize. All these things are absolutely important. All these things are things we can talk about. I don't think they are core or they're unique to developer experience. The thing I do want to talk about that I think is really important to developer experience is your collaboration and culture within your organization can really be summed up in three ways. It's what you promote, it's what you punish, and it's what you tolerate. And what I mean by this is I want to be explicit with I want the organization to be explicit in that our culture is something that we have a hand in. We are constantly shepherding this. And to think about it is any behavior that you've tolerated that you don't immediately correct is going to become the cultural baseline for your organization. Is it okay to skip unit tests? Fine. Then that becomes part of your culture. Is it okay to skip certain things? If not, then that becomes your culture, right? You have a culture that doesn't skip unit tests. Do you delay a release because you have found quality issues, or do you ship things out of the door and fix things later, right? All those things, behaviorally, what you tolerate, what you punish, and what you promote, implicitly and explicitly, is your culture, is your engineering culture. And people, when they come in, they see what happens. They see what people do that gets punished. They see what they do to get ahead. And that's what they either mimic or they basically say, this isn't for me, and they leave. And so I think it's really important to understand what you promote, what you punish, and what you tolerate, because punishment isn't a firing punishment, right? It's also an intervention. Where do you go and say, discipline privately type of situation where you say, this is not okay. This is not acceptable behavior, whether it's in a meeting or how you handle code, how you handle customer interactions, what needs to address, because the floor of what you tolerate, again, is what you're going to get most of the time. And so setting a high bar means enforcing a high standard across your organization. And that includes then the flip side. So we talked about the carrot, the stick a little bit, the carrot of what you promote. The people that you promote and how you promote them, right? And this can be shout outs on all hands. It can be obviously promotions and title and pay. These also signal to the organization, this is behavior that we want to spotlight and amplify. And so that includes, and I think should explicitly include, a different route for individual contributors to become more and more seen and impactful, as well as management. You see this a lot in the developer organizations and conversations around it, and that is that the only way to get ahead after you get to senior level is to become manager. And I think that that caps a lot of potential for people. And there's a growing thread now of individual contributors um, having ranks that basically are equivalent to a VP in terms of seniority, in terms of pay, in terms of impact. And I think that that's a good thing. So when you look at collaboration and culture, I think it's important to think about it from this particular lens. There are other lenses absolutely you should look at as well, but from a cultural perspective, this is key. And I think for managers in particular, this is something that they need to know within their employee handbook, that they have HR backing to make sure that they have the right tools at their disposal to address things. Because, like I said, if you do not shepherd it proactively, then your culture is going to be something that develops. And oftentimes that usually has a lower common denominator than people would like. Another topic, this one's quick and relatively isolated, but I think it's worth mentioning. The relationship between the software quality and the quality of your process, I think, are the two core symbiotic feedback loops, whatever metaphor you want to use here. They are the two inputs that go into your ability to sustainably and consistently develop and push out new functionality reliably. And when we look at a developer organization in isolation, that's really what you want. In abstraction, you want them to be reliable and sustainable and consistently be able to deliver the work that they commit to. It is much more important that they have a consistent pace, that they have a variable pace that occasionally misses a deadline that's important. That risk is disproportionately painful to an organization, and so can't be handled or can't be accepted. That said, there's a lot of emphasis, and there has been so far, on process, and I think rightly so. But there is absolutely a constant feedback loop in terms of the code quality in and of itself. And that's one to think about as well. So bad code obviously is hard to work on and makes the process much more full of friction. And so it's important to realize that your process has an input, and that is your current code base. And that includes all your technical debt. That includes all the idiosyncrasies and the inconsistencies in naming conventions, um, coding paradigms, linting, etc. And so it's worth looking at the quality of the code as it currently stands as its own thing to constantly manage as well. So you can look at the process and you look at the code. And a key thing to think about this is the prototypical "we'll fix it later" thing that always ends up in production, never gets fixed. So if you have a process that allows someone to come in at the 11th hour and say, "I need you to put this functionality in this release or else," um, in my experiences, it's always been some sort of VP of sales because that's what's going to win the largest deal. Um, and if you can hack that in, you do oftentimes, because individual contributors or even engineering managers often don't have the seniority to push back on someone that like that. And so it gets thrown in haphazardly with the intent to fix later. There's never bandwidth to fix. And then you have one gap. Your code quality on average deteriorates. And if this happens frequently enough, obviously the average code quality deteriorates quite rapidly. And so a key thing in your process is what I would consider code hygiene, right? There is a consistent need or recurring need, frankly, to constantly update your code to address technical debt. Because while this fake VP of engineering use case is symbolic of a certain type of behavior, another thing that also happens all the time is just the entropy of code. And so what was good and fit for purpose a year ago may no longer be the case now because the context and the situation of the company has changed. And so you need a process that allows for that as a check on that entropy of code. And similarly, you want to obviously make sure that the better code you have, the more maintainable, the more modular, the more robust it is, the easier it is to build on it, right? So good code and good process symbiotically can lead to good velocity and a sustainable pattern. Bad code leads to a bit more friction. Bad process leads to bad code, et cetera, right? So these are two things that you want working in harmony because they are kind of the key pillars here. Um, I'm going to go on my soapbox a little bit here and talk a little bit about hiring and onboarding because I think that, like I said, a lot of the conversation focuses on your software development lifecycle in terms of following the work from planning all the way to operations. And it's worth doing, but I think there are a couple other metrics that don't get talked about enough that I think are really, really important organizationally to track and to proactively manage. There's hiring and onboarding, and they're two parts. So I think one of the biggest underrated metrics that you can present as an engineering organization about your culture is your average developer tenure across your teams. There's two reasons for that. One, the longer someone stays within your organization, the more they can contribute. Someone's first month, we all know, is not going to be overly productive. But each incremental month, when you get to that average tenure point, is increasingly more productive, right? So you get to a point conceptually where every extra month you can get someone, they're going to be able to do, in theory, the most valuable work they can do for your organization. So you're actually getting progressively greater returns the longer someone stays with you. So all else being equal, an extra month of tenure is worth a lot. There's also the flip side of that. So hiring is a cost. It costs on average, I looked this up, between $30,000 and $80,000 in opportunity cost to hire a single senior developer. That is a combination of TA having to put out a resume or a job description, managing, screening, your engineering managers interviewing, screening, doing the tests, your teams doing cultural fitness tests and everything else across the board. Now, if we look at this from a tenure perspective, that means you're going to be hiring someone on average once during each of those tenure periods, right? So, for example, if my average tenure is 3 years, then I'm likely going to have to hire a person every 3 years for the size of my team. And so obviously the further I can push tenure out, the more opportunity cost I can save. And this is in a pure lean waste concept. This is savings because you can apply that time to valuable work. And if you do the math, and I'm happy to do it with you, um, I think that for every 100 developers organization that you have, so Fortune 500 companies obviously have a lot to benefit here, but any organization of that size, you can normalize to 100 developers. For any extra year of tenure you can create, you will unlock $1 million in time for your engineering organization to apply to other things. They don't have to work harder. They don't have to work longer. They don't even have to have better tooling. Everything else being equal, and in most cases they obviously are not, but everything else being equal, $1 million can be saved for each extra year of tenure. Not to mention this signals obviously to potentially hiring candidates because if they see the turnover rate is 3 years, they're not as likely to be sticking around as long because they know that that's the case. If you compare that to an organization where the average tenure is 8 to 12 years, that is a very different signal because developers obviously have a lot of insight into the market and they can vote with their feet. So your hiring process in and of itself, you need to standardize and streamline purely from an onboarding perspective as well. Excuse me. You want to make sure that this is easy because the other part to this, so that's the hiring portion, but the onboarding part is also how fast can people deliver value? And it sets the tone in many cases for their entire tenure term of service within the organization. And the reason being is not only is the onboarding process important to get them up to speed fast, it is a great proxy for how well your organization values that developer time, that knowledge management, that ability to quickly spin up infrastructure, developer tooling, get people contributing quickly. And so this is an underrated or unappreciated area, I think, when it comes to DevEx, because There is a lot of value to be had here, and a lot of people are not looking here to create extra value. This is also a long tail. It takes a long time to impact this, obviously. If you're currently at a situation where the average tenure is 3 years, it's going to take you a long, long time to get the average tenure up to 8 years. Um, Simple math says 5 years at the very least, and that assumes that you have fixed things right away. So it's an area where I think investment, it's not, it shouldn't be a core focus area, but I think it's a really good metric to track because it's really hard to game. And a lot of the metrics that can be gamed often are. And so I want to make sure that we also highlight situations that, this is something that you can be very deliberate about. I'll spend a little bit talking about clarity and purpose. I think it's worth mentioning. It's different than um, pure knowledge management. There absolutely should be a way for an individual contributor and engineering manager to see what type of work they're doing and how it contributes to the overall goal of the company. Mission, vision, vision board, whatever you want to do, whatever company structure you have for that, it's important for people to understand how their work connects to that. It gives them a way to create purpose from their work within the context of the organization. It also allows them to make better decisions locally because they can make the decisions that would align to that priority and vision. Similarly, and it relates again to developer tenure and a bunch of other, again, all these things are connected, is you want to have a company mission that correctly resonates with your individuals. And there's 2 points to this that I want to make. One is, does your mission align with your individual priorities? Right? You have organizations that say we tackle really hard problems, and that can be great because that aligns with a lot of people. That's what they want to do. They want to stretch themselves intellectually at work, tackle hard problems. Another organization can be, we are here to protect the environment. We are here to protect the children, cure cancer. All those things. There's no wrong answer for a company mission. There probably is, but effectively, there's no coherent right answer. It just you want one that resonates with your people, and you want to make sure that it's clear and articulated. The other dimension to this, obviously, is also that it be true. So it's all well and good to say we want to protect the environment, but if your CEO is taking a private jet to every meeting, he's not really living the values. And so, does the company mission and values accurately reflect reality? Are they ingrained in everything you do? Again, this is bigger than DevEx, but an important factor because it impacts morale, it impacts buy-in, it impacts how much you want to really put into this and stick around. So all these things, again, are just a subset of all the different elements that go into DevEx. And so good DevEx is where you are explicit and deliberate across the board. You understand why you put the investment in because you'll see greater returns. All this is easier said than done, obviously, but it starts by being aware of the different areas you can impact and how they impact one another. So, speaking of that, how do we measure this? I mentioned already ahead of time, there is no single DevEx metric. No one's going to get a 10 out of 10 because there is no, again, objective measure for that. Um, Dora, so the folks, I think they're sponsored by Google, but used to be Google, um, has 4 key metrics that people look at. They're very DevOps focused, but that's actually really good because it sits downstream. They are, however, very focused on process and tooling for your organization. Those are the top 4 here. Mean time to recovery, deployment frequency, lead time for changes, and change failure rates. Um, I have 2 columns here. These are kind of relatively generous or conservative, depending on your definition of good and bad. I think mean time to recovery, less than an hour, is good. If it takes you more than 3 days, you're in trouble. These boundaries obviously are, like I said, reality is probably closer or less extreme, I guess. I think more than a day is probably bad anyway, but um, it in context it matters. I've added 5 other ones just to give you a sampling. Um, this is not a complete list again. What matters is going to differ in your organizational context. The point is, however, that while there is no single measure, you can measure a lot of things, and it's worth improving a lot of them because they are going to be proxy metrics for the organization as a whole. And not measuring it is a great way to not be able to track progress. And so I think it's important to look at PR cycle time. It should take on average less than a day for a pull request to get reviewed. Time to first commit. So for a new hire, I think it should be less than a week. Um, how you handle critical vulnerabilities. Do you have a bench, like, do you have a standard operating procedure? And do you measure how this goes? I think it should be less than 2 hours before vulnerability is identified and a plan of action is put in place to mitigate it. Again, a lot of these things, they stretch across the boundaries. Deep work, to my earlier point, from an individual perspective, do they have more than do they have more than 4 opportunities of 3 hours a week to work? If not, then you're probably not getting the most out of them. And then work aligned to business value. I think anything over 50% is golden. Um, I think 50% may be too ambitious to shoot for. Anything under 10% is probably worth looking at because there's all kinds of problems hidden behind that metric. Obviously, you don't just get numbers. There are a lot of tools out there you can use. GetDX is a great one. Flow is a great one. We have experience with both. Not everything will show up in a pretty dashboard. Some of it you're going to have to go through surveys, talk to people. I think it's important, however, to have the feedback loops that these metrics allow. So it's not just we're measuring these things, and this is just an example from Flow on tracking to business value, but it's we're measuring this to create a feedback loop to actually address this, right? One of the worst things you can do organizationally is start to ask your developers for ways to improve their lives and then not seeing any actual impact of that. Then you'll no longer get active, candid feedback from your teams because they don't believe that you'll do anything with it. They'll just say everything's fine. But in reality, it's not, right? So it's important to make sure that you look at qualitative and quantitative measures for this. You make sure that they are understood within the context that they operate in. So that's your organizational priorities and everything else. And that you understand that measuring is a commitment to improving a lot of these things. And I would argue strongly that because DevEx as a whole is effectively your ROI equation for your investment in your developer organization from a salaries, from an IT infrastructure, tooling, etc., it's worth looking at your efficiency here. And so that's something comprehensive that we'd love to do. And speaking of, that's basically brings us to the Q&A section. Yep. Hello, everyone. Um, Apologies for the slightly jarring transition. Um, we have some time here to answer any questions live. If you have them, feel free to throw them into either Q&A or the chat. We'll monitor both of them. I have one already to at least pick up on, and then I'll give you guys time. And if there are no further questions, we'll obviously just end things early and give everybody some time back. The question I got, let me try and um, summarize it a little bit easily. It's around the metrics, specifically around the transition time one can expect, depending on how bad things are. Like how long does it take to see improvement? The answer obviously is it depends. But I'll try and give you something more meaty than it depends because that's obviously a bit of a non-answer. So for the DORA metrics, traditionally, you can see improvements over the course of probably a couple of months. So consider it, say, 3 to 4 or 5 months, you'll start to see measurable improvements if you start changing fundamental pieces of how you operate the software. They will generally plateau because there's usually low-hanging fruit that you can address, and they'll improve things a little bit. But the reason the DORA metrics are so impactful and so useful is because they have this kind of way of capturing the results of an end-to-end process. And so you'll probably have to do work across the system to actually see meaningful improvement. So you got to do a lot of little bits to see a major improvement at the end. A couple other ones that are faster to improve, I think, are things like your standard operating procedure for handling CVEs. That's just a directive, and you should test them fairly easily. You can do fire drills and things like that with your development team. That helps a lot. And you can benchmark what that looks like because there are real scenarios that you can pull up past scenarios and use those as guidelines. So you could say, what happens when AWS New York goes down, or if you have something like Log4j. Um, so those are examples that you could say like use as training examples. And if you don't feel like you're getting um, the metrics that you're looking for, the impact you're looking for, you obviously would do fire drills more frequently to get the improvement and proactive coaching. Um, the last one I think we've seen a lot of is the deep work time. So one of the key things there is you can go by team and look at their calendar and find the meetings that are obviously kind of like in the middle of the morning or in the middle of the afternoon. Like those in particular are ones that you should just move. And so when you batch meetings, you create gaps in the calendar naturally. So those are quick ones that you can do that have knock-on effects that usually see rapid improvement. The other question we got is tied to that is just like, what are some other metrics you can look at? Um, the best answer I can give you is most people will look where they think the problems are. So depending on how your software development lifecycle flows, you'll try and get some signals out of each step. You'll look at your QA systems, you'll look at your security posture, you'll look at your planning process, and you'll start to get a feel for how does the process flow between each one? How long does each one take? And how long do you think each one should take? And then you can diagnose. So there's a way to kind of benchmark each one. There's the time component, and then there's the quality component that goes with it. One of the things we see a lot of when we have these conversations with clients is folks aren't just trying to measure things, they want to actually improve the overall system. And one of the things you end up doing is trying to front load some of the hard stuff. So the eponymous shifting left of security and quality is a common one there. Um, so what you're trying to do is you make things more efficient towards the tail end by moving some of those considerations in the planning phase, because you can do a lot more of those things in parallel and you can start to identify faults early. And it's an initially counterintuitive experience because if you move things early, you're making one of the steps bigger, a longer, more complex, but you're actually creating kind of in that lean process mindset, you're creating earlier points of failure. So you're wasting less time on processes that should have been addressed and problems that should have been addressed earlier. So rather than finding a QA or security issue while things go to production, you want to find them in planning, right? So that's kind of a system change that we can see a lot of people make. You do this incrementally, right? There are ways to add security processes early, and there's no standard template from a you must do these things and follow this checklist, but oftentimes people do end up trying to find patterns, and there are patterns you can follow at each step, and you would incrementally go from basically the deployment step in the SDLC, and you shift progressively more left. So you do threat modeling right before deployment, and then you do resiliency testing, and then you'd add security to your QA component, and then you would bring security modeling into your planning and development process and make sure that that's part of it. And so you progressively move things left, and then you do the same for QA, and you do the same thing for everything else. And that generally has a way of making the system leaner and faster because you're moving things to a point where things that are going to cause problems, you want to identify those before you've spent a lot of work on it that you then have to redo, right? You're minimizing the rework component. Um, that seems to be the only questions that we've had so far. Um, as we've posted already in the chat, like feel free to connect with me on LinkedIn or send me an email if you have anything else. Most of these topics we will cover actually in more depth in a couple blog posts or maybe follow on webinars with some of our partners. So if you find something that you're interested in, but you can't really define a question yet, stay tuned. We'll put out some more information for people to kind of pick up on and ask the questions on. And then, like I said, we'll be happy to have the conversation, pick up any of these things, like I said, on LinkedIn or email. And if that's nothing else, then like I said, feel free to reach out. And otherwise, I appreciate the time you've put in here, sharing it with me. And I hope you guys have an afternoon or a morning that's great.